you all for joining us tonight. I'm Cynthia Gorney. I'm one of the faculty members at the Graduate School of Journalism, and I happen to be sort of ex-colleagues and buddies with the three people from the Washington Post who are going to be up on the stage here tonight. Four people from the Washington Post who are going to be on the stage tonight, having worked there a long time ago. This is a Herb Caen San Francisco Chronicle lecture series, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the series, UC Berkeley, and the Graduate School of Journalism. Our guests tonight are Jackie Spinner, a graduate of UC Berkeley's program who has been a staff writer for the Washington Post since 1995. In her book, Tell Them I Didn't Cry, Jackie recounts her experience in 2004 as a war reporter in Baghdad for the Washington Post. Her twin sister, Jenny Spinner, shares how she and the rest of the family dealt with Jackie's reporting assignment and the effect it had on her relationship with her sister. And she's joined by Steve Fainaru, who worked for 11 years at the Boston Globe, during which time he covered the Boston Red Sox, served as the New York bureau chief and Latin America bureau chief. Steve has a wide palette. Worked as an investigative reporter, came to the Washington Post in 2000, and he's worked as an investigative reporter in sports. Yeah, you got that right. An investigative reporter in sports, covered civil liberties and the war on terrorism. When I first met him when he moved out here to California, I said, so what do they have you doing? And he said, sports, investigation, and foreign. And I said, really? But that is, in fact, what he's been doing. He's the co-author of The Duke of Havana, Cuba, Baseball, and the Search for the American Dream. His pieces from Iraq were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting last year. And we are also joined by someone that I first knew by name when I was hanging out one afternoon with Steve and said, so one of the applicants to our school this year is this young Iraqi named Omar Fekeiki who works in the Baghdad Bureau, and Steve's comment was, oh, for God's sake, let him in right now, don't even talk about it. He said, he's great. So we took Steve's advice and we did. He worked as a stringer at the Washington Post Baghdad Bureau. We are lucky to have him, and he's now a student, a first-year student at the Graduate School of Journalism. And finally, Rajiv Chandrasekaran is an assistant managing editor at the Washington Post, where he's worked since 1994. He served for the Post as the bureau chief in Baghdad and Cairo and Southeast Asia, as a correspondent covering the war in Afghanistan. He's recently finished a term as journalist in residence at the International Reporting Project at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. And his new book, called Imperial Life in the Emerald City Inside Iraq's Green Zone, was just recently named last week as a finalist for the National Book Award. Both Jackie and Rajiv will be outside afterward signing any copies. The books are on sale there, and if you'd like a personalized signature, they'll help you out. And finally, Orville Schell, Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism, who added to his many international travels this past spring when he spent time in Baghdad watching firsthand some of the extraordinary challenges to reporting this war in particular. His account, Baghdad, the Besieged Press, appeared in April in the New York Review of Books. With that, let's welcome them all up on stage.
Greetings. It's great to have you all here, and it's a real treat because I think tonight we have one of those rare opportunities to have something of an ecology of one media outlet, one newspaper in this case, that galvanized itself, and it continues to do so, to cover what I think we'd all have to agree is probably the most important story for our country today. So we have different correspondents who've been in Baghdad and in Iraq at different times. So I thought we'd start out. I want to ask you all, and I think the order is going to be Rajiv first, yes, and then Steve second, or were you third?
I think third.
Third. Jackie second, Steve third, and then Omar fourth, because that is the series at which they came in on this story. So let me start by asking you all, what was it that you had in your heads in terms of your expectations of how you would cover this war, whether the war would be successful. What did you imagine when you first came into this story? And then, when you came out of it, how had your perceptions of the war and your paper's ability to cover it changed? Now, I should say Steve is about to go back to Baghdad next week, is it?
Yeah, a couple of weeks.
And of course, one question we will want to ask him is why. But let's start off, Rajiv, who came into the story first of the four.
I've got to say, when I returned to Baghdad on the 10th of April, 2003, that was the day after the statue of Saddam Hussein was felled in Firdous Square, in many ways, I was just as enthusiastic as the Iraqi people, as they were reveling in their liberation. I, having spent the bulk of the 6 months leading up to the conflict in Baghdad, the bad old days, living in the Al Rashid Hotel, forced to be accompanied by an information ministry minder everywhere I wanted to go, every single interview I wanted to have with an Iraqi, from an ordinary person on the street to a government official, having to be approved by the Ministry of Information, by the now famous Minister Sahaf and his underlings. I knew how onerous it was and how difficult it was to really get Iraqis to feel free enough to speak candidly. In fact, it was next to impossible before the war. And so when I returned back, I was filled with anticipation and quite literally thrilled that I'd be able to talk to Iraqis without a minder present. I'd be able to have open and honest exchanges. I'd be able to travel the country and see this place that I had spent 6 months in, but had only sort of seen through the soda straw, glasses that the information ministry wanted foreign correspondents to wear. And true enough, it was a journalist's dream in those early days. You could go out and jump in the car and drive out west to Ramadi if you wanted to, up north to Crete, down to Basra. So long as you had gas in the tank and a bottle of water and maybe something to eat, you were fine. You didn't need armored vehicles. You didn't need a flak jacket. In fact, I kept a flak jacket, but in the trunk of the car. You had a translator. You had a car that was willing to go. You were fine. I mean, the only troubles we really encountered in those early days were sort of running out of gas. And I remember out near Ramadi once having to siphon something out of a bulldozer and put it in the car. And when I went up to people and said, I'm from the Washington Post, they embraced me. They wanted to tell their stories. They invited me into their homes. In fact, I joke that the greatest danger I faced in those early weeks and those early months was actually being invited into somebody's house and being served sort of meat of unknown provenance for lunch. I mean, they didn't have good refrigeration at the time. You couldn't quite know whether you were going to get sick from drinking the tea and eating the meat, but they wanted to talk. Nobody was out to really do any harm to Western journalists. And it was in I think if you look in the recent history of Iraq, and particularly the world of media coverage of Iraq, that was the golden era. That was the time where we really could do what foreign correspondents are supposed to do, go out and tell the ground truth. It was in those days when you had a report of perhaps a shooting at a checkpoint out in Anbar province. You just saddled up, got on the car, drove out there, and you would go and you'd talk to eyewitnesses. They'd talk to you. You might go and drive into the little nearby village and talk to some of the families of the victims. They would talk to you. They wouldn't threaten you. Then you just pull your car up to the nearest American military base, wave your press card, and they'd welcome you in, and you could go and speak to the commanding officer. You could walk around the base. Now, of course, none of that's possible. Nobody's driving outside of Baghdad. If you want to travel outside the capital, you're flying in a military helicopter or in a really armored convoy. Nobody drives right up to a military base anymore unless you want to get shot up. And nobody just sort of goes out trying to interview in little tiny villages the relatives of people who have been shot in an encounter with coalition forces. But it wasn't, I guess the first real challenge I faced at that time was trying to assemble a bureau. I was there as the Post bureau chief, and we had at that point 8 to 10 Washington Post reporters who had descended on Baghdad, in addition to photographers and op-ed columnists, and we needed infrastructure. You needed translators, you needed drivers, you needed other support personnel, and I count myself incredibly blessed to have found, among others, to have had the chance to work with Omar here. And Omar came to work for the Washington Post sort of through a fluke. One of our colleagues was out struggling trying to interview some Iraqis in front of the Palestine Hotel. And young Omar had come to the hotel to try to use the phone of a BBC reporter to call his relatives in London to let them know that he and his family had survived the bombing. And he stepped in to try to help our colleague conduct the interviews. And she thought to herself, boy, this guy's English is good, and he's a real eager, polite go-getter. And she advised him to come back the next morning to talk to me and to see whether he might get a job. And we kept Omar around for, I don't know, a week or two to help. And then for whatever reason, in a very foolish move, I sent him home. And I said, well, we're sort of out of work for you now. But I quickly realized the error of my ways, and we sent a driver calling for him within a few days. And from that point on, he worked as a translator, as an office manager, and eventually as a full-fledged reporter, going out and reporting and writing his own stories. A remarkable transition. And in the world of Iraq, Omar and his colleagues are one of the rare success stories of the American involvement in Iraq. But how does one actually build a staff out there? You can't just put an ad in the paper saying looking for reporters or looking for translators. You don't know who you'll get. And we at the Washington Post have a very strict no nepotism policy. If I work there, my younger brother, for instance, can't get a job there. But I'm fond of also joking that I violated this no nepotism policy at every twist and turn. Almost everybody who works for the Post Bureau, Iraqi, are either relatives or friends or former co-workers or neighbors of one another. Everybody has some sort of connection. And we were, again, very fortunate through these informal networks to have built up a staff of very talented Iraqis from a variety of backgrounds. And they, today, in the early days, they were essential in helping us doing things like translating during interviews and doing some of the basics that foreign journalists do in helping American correspondents overseas, primarily in a support role. But what is really remarkable here is the arc that they all have taken in their professional development. It's not just Omar, but many of his colleagues too have grown into real full-fledged journalists. I joke that we weren't just running a bureau there when I was there, when Jackie was running the bureau too, but we were also acting as journalism teachers and teaching people who had never worked as journalists before, never operated in a free society, how to work, how to be aggressive reporters, how to be fair and unbiased, and how to report and pull together stories. And they really have stepped up to the challenge, and I dare say an awful lot of the reporting that you read, that goes into the stories that you see in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times and every other major American print outlet, as well as major broadcast outlets, radio and television, are the result of brave, hardworking Iraqis who are out there putting their lives on the line every day so that we can really develop a better understanding of what's happening in that country. Things have gotten way too dangerous for Western correspondents to be going out and about to the scenes of car bombings, to the scenes of sectarian fighting. Often, a lot of that really hard work is done by very, very brave Iraqis, and they are my heroes, and I dare say they're the heroes of all of us who work at the Washington Post. A couple of other just quick points to make in talking about my period there and the arc of my time. Of course, one of my chief challenges while I was there was to cover the Coalition Provisional Authority, the American occupation government in Iraq. And if being able to talk to Iraqis was the great thrill of the job, having to deal with American bureaucrats cloistered in the green zone was the great challenge, was the big headache. the American civilians who showed up in Baghdad literally transplanted sort of White House press rules in the green zone. And so while you could now go out as a journalist and talk to Iraqis without a minder, you couldn't really go and talk to your fellow Americans without a minder. They learned some tricks from the past. And the CPA's press office put out a requirement that, you couldn't go and troll the halls of the palace without an escort. You needed an escort from the Strategic Communications Office to take you in to the palace to sit there during interviews. And staffers with the occupation administration were told in no uncertain terms that they were not to speak on the record to journalists without a minder present, or they'd be on the next C-130 back home. And, just getting basic candor from officials was next to impossible. I write about this a little bit in my book, and one incredibly telling exchange was with the former chief spokesman of the Occupation Authority, who always stayed on message in front of the camera. And it was just one moment where he finally, to a small group of journalists, without the cameras rolling, kind of broke down in a moment of unvarnished honesty. And this is incredibly telling about the approach they took. During the wave of violence in the spring of 2004, he was queried by reporters, to help not just explain it, but to justify American policy. And he turned to them. This is Dan Senor, Bremer's chief spokesman. He said, "Off the record, Paris is burning. On the record, security and stability are returning to Iraq." By that time, Iraq had become a fundamentally different place than when I arrived. The days of getting in your car and driving around were no longer. First it was the road out toward Fallujah and Ramadi, then the road up to Tikrit, then the road down to Basra, and then the road to Hilla came next, and that quickly earned the name the Highway of Death. And my last trip on it, we were driving back from visiting a cleric in the city, and I was fortunate enough to be with a driver we called Omar 2. This is Omar 1. Omar 2, fortunately, was a former Iraqi Air Force fighter pilot. He had flown MiGs, and so I felt comfortable with him behind the wheel of an 8-cylinder Mercedes-Benz. And as we were barreling up the highway, we were being followed very closely by a car full of fairly suspicious individuals. And as we sped up, they sped up, and we went a little faster, and they went a little faster. And finally, Omar 2 just gunned it. And we tried to outrun them and then peeled off the side of the road. And we managed to evade them. We had a chase car with some guards in it, and we got separated from them. When we finally all reconnected in Baghdad, the guards told us about a number of cars that they had seen that had been shot up on the road, and we clearly hadn't seen those. So those had taken place, those shootings, clearly in the minutes between our car having driven that stretch of road and the guards' car. And the next day we picked up the newspaper, one of the largest circulating newspapers in Baghdad, and read that 17 people had been killed on that stretch of highway that afternoon. And by the time I left in the fall of 2004, and Jackie started taking over, Iraq had gotten sufficiently dangerous that foreign correspondents really didn't venture outside of their compounds without good reason. Sure, people got out and about, and they still do today. Very brave reporters, and you would plan your trips very carefully. You would go in an armored vehicle. We got 2 of them, in fact. This is a little aside. In the summer of 2003. It became clear that we needed armored cars there. In fact, the first reason for it was we were worried that we might actually get caught in the crossfire between American forces and Iraqi insurgents, and we thought that it was more likely we might actually get shot by the Americans. So I petitioned the Post for a $90,000 armored Jeep Cherokee. We finally got one, and then a few months later we got a second one. But these things came in from Europe with bright, shiny silver paint, and they looked like the vehicles contractors would have. And after a while, we thought these things really aren't going to fit in. They really scream foreigner. They scream, please shoot me. So I engaged in the Baghdad equivalent of pimp my ride. For $60 a pop, we took them to Sadr City and had them sandblasted. One of them was turned into the Flower of Lebanon taxi cab. The other had carpeting put on the dashboard, fuzzy dice hanging from the mirror, and pictures of Shiite imams that had little kind of suction cup things you could put on the back. So if you were going down to the Shiite heartland, you could put a nice picture of Imam Ali up on the back window. But you'd always, of course, want to roll that down if you were going out into Sunni areas. But in any event, you had to do things like this to cope and adapt. And by the time I left, after 18 months as the post bureau chief, it was a fundamentally different country, a fundamentally different environment in which to operate, and an environment of far greater threat, and in an environment in which journalists really had a much greater difficulty at telling the ground truth, at really understanding what was going on in that city. And I dare say it's become much more difficult today, and I suppose as this conversation goes on, we can talk a little bit about our perceptions about media coverage in the here and now, but that's sort of the arc of my time there.
Well, thanks, Rajiv. Jackie?
Well, when I came to Iraq in May of 2004, things were dramatically different than Rajiv was experienced when he was first there. I couldn't go out to restaurants. I couldn't go out and really talk to people. I was always incognito wherever I went. It was my first foreign assignment, and it was one that I did with great trepidation. I couldn't simply leave the bureau and go report unless it was to the green zone. I was always the silent Iraqi woman dressed appropriately behind whomever the translator was at the time. And I think that really shows how dramatically things have changed over time. It started as an experience where reporters could go out and to be foreign reporters and to experience life as Iraqis experienced it, to a situation now where it's even worse than when I was there last in November of last year, where American reporters are targets themselves. That's an unusual situation for journalists to be. We are infidels. On the long list of infidels the insurgents have, American reporters are at the top of the list. And so one of our greatest fears was obviously being kidnapped. I survived a kidnapping attempt outside of Abu Ghraib prison shortly after I arrived in Iraq, and I'm still dealing with the mental after effects of that. But that's a very unusual thing as a journalist. When you go into a story, you see yourself as an impartial observer, somebody who's just there to tell what's going on. But in Iraq, there's no immunity for a reporter. It is the most dangerous environment journalists have ever known. And every single one of us who are up here, Americans, are alive because of our brave Iraqi staff, because they kept us alive when we were there. And we're lucky to be here. We're lucky to be alive because it's that dangerous of an environment. So why does a journalist go? Everybody probably has a different answer to that, but I think that we all go because of the sense of purpose we feel to telling the story. It's the greatest story my generation has ever known. And I begged for a year to go to Iraq because I wanted to be there and I wanted to be part of that story. And I think everyone here will attest to that. As dangerous as it is the place to be. It is the story that has to be told. The media get a lot of flack for how we tell that story. We get charged with inflating how bad the violence is. Well, we don't make up the images that are on television. We don't make up the paragraphs we write in our stories. That we are reflecting the reality of Iraq, and it is a very dangerous place, not only for American reporters who are there, but as Omar will attest, for Iraqi families and Iraqis who are there. And yet we have to be there. We have to tell the story. And that's pretty much all I have to say right now.
Well, thanks, Jackie. Steve.
I got to Iraq in September of 2004 in the fall, and I had done some foreign correspondence work before, but I really didn't have great expectations of sort of exactly what it was going to be. All my editors told me was, we'd like you to write about the American experience in Iraq, and I didn't really know exactly what that meant, but I knew there was going to be a lot of embedding that would involved in that I would be traveling around with the U.S. military a lot. And I knew there had been a lot of controversy around the embedding program and the idea of putting reporters, linking them up with specific American units. And so I remember going to Rajiv and sitting down in the cafeteria at the Post before I went. I'm like, well, so what's it like? And he goes, oh, it's a lot like camping, just bring your sleeping bag, bring a flashlight, bring so I'm like, oh, okay, camping, right. So a few weeks later, while I was out camping, I was driving around Sadr City with one platoon that at the time the 1st Cavalry Division was in charge of Baghdad, and so I was patrolling around Sadr City, camping, and we pulled up in a vacant lot, and we're just sort of sitting there, and the guys there's an Iraqi truck in front of us, and it was been a long day. I was kind of dozing in the back of the vehicle. All of a sudden, there's just this huge explosion, just this, about a fireball about as big as this ceiling, and then all I remember is just seeing this gray, sort of yellowish dust, and then the dust cleared, and everybody was sort of touching themselves to sort of make sure they were okay, and all the Iraqi guys who were in the pickup truck in front of us were dead. They were just gone, and so that was, I think, the second time I had been embedded in Iraq, and I think at that point I had already. I mean, you don't need an investigative reporter to know. You don't need to be an investigative reporter to sort of figure out Baghdad and sort of how bad it is. As soon as you get out in the airport, it's right in your face. But the experience of embedding was, for me, it was, when I got there. I had sort of heard about all the problems with the program, but I have to say that when I first started doing it, I like Rajiv said at the beginning of the invasion, I felt like it was some sort of like almost, at least journalistically, it was this incredible dream world where the stories were happening right in front of you, and they involved these incredible characters these soldiers who were incredibly brave and incredibly articulate and had no hesitation about telling you sort of how they felt about the war. It was completely different than the experience that I would have in Baghdad. When I'd go over to the Green Zone, as Rajiv talked about, you'd sit in with diplomats and briefings with diplomats, and you'd attend press conferences, and there was a lot of spin and a lot of message and a lot of sort of telling you exactly sort of what was going on outside the Green Zone, even though these people were really not experiencing it themselves. But I found that when you got on the ground out with the troops, that there was no spin. It was all sort of right in front of you. And this was actually driven home to me while I was traveling south of Baghdad. I think it was like maybe the 2nd or 3rd embed I was on. And I was just basically driving around in a truck with a bunch of Marines. And we were just going from one base to another. And suddenly the convoy stopped. And the commanders ordered these guys out, and they ordered them to search all the cars on the highway these cars that had backed up because the Americans were passing, and so they couldn't move. And so these guys get out of the truck, and they're grumbling. They're not happy about it. And I follow this one guy up into a bus, and he's carrying his M16, and he walks up the aisle, and then he walks back down the aisle, and he turns to me as he gets off the bus, and he says, "You know what we just did? We just scared the living out of a whole bunch of people." That's exactly what we did. So then we get back in the truck, and these guys are all pissed off about sort of what, they've just been asked to do. They think it's sort of a dog and pony show. And then these guys, they're just Marines, they start debating the war in Iraq. And I'm sitting there with them. And it's like, it's one thing to be sitting in front of your television, watching Tim Russert and a bunch of other people just sort of talking about what's going on in Iraq. But to me, it was just a revelation to be sitting there listening to these Marines talk about the war, and pro and con. At one point, one guy goes, what exactly are we doing here? Like, why are we here? And then another guy would say, well, we're here to protect these people, and this is what we're going to do. And it was all just sort of this back and forth. And there was this one guy who had been a volunteer fireman, and he had joined the Marines because of one of his colleagues had been killed in the Twin Towers. And he's going on and on about how, this isn't what I signed up for. This is not the war that I signed up for. I understand Afghanistan, but, I don't really know why we're here. The Iraqis don't seem to want us here. We go out, we try to make friends with them, they shoot at us. And so I'm at one point, so I pull out my notebook, and I'm like, do you guys mind if I take a few notes? And they're like, sure. And so they're going on. And so finally I said to these guys, like 19 and 20-year-old kids, this is going to appear, probably on the front page of the Washington Post. It's one of the biggest newspapers in the world. And, so if you have any concerns about this, you might want to express them now. And so there's like this pause, and then one of the guys turns to me and he goes, we don't give a crap. Because what are they going to do? Send us to Iraq? So I really, at least at the beginning, I really felt that the Embed program, at least for me in my experience, at least at the beginning, it was just this incredible revelation where, all these unbelievable stories just falling out, almost literally out of the sky. But over time, I sort of began to see it for what it was and the real drawbacks that existed.
Deja vu.
And the problems are not sort of what I had been told that they were. There's no censorship from the military. Nobody's reading your stories. Nobody's really telling you what to write. There's no, people, from the sort of lieutenant colonel on up, people would try to spin you, but, there was none of that. And I never really felt like I was like this kept reporter, by the military. But the problem was that the military would control your movements. They could control your movements. Because of the security restrictions, you pretty much at this point, you can't go very many places without the military. And so if you write a story that they didn't like, then they could keep you out of areas for a while. I mean, there was a period in like the middle of last year where I thought there were, a bunch of places I would never get back to, Mosul and Tal Afar. I literally got kicked off a base in Tal Afar because of a story that I hadn't even written that I was trying to write. And they just literally, they put a guard outside my room, and the guy followed me around for the rest of the day, and then they put me on a helicopter the next day, and that was the last time that I was in Tal Afar. So the Embed program has really sort of gone full circle. At the beginning, it was, you had hundreds of reporters embedded at the beginning of the invasion. As of last month, there were 11 reporters embedded covering the U.S. military in Iraq, 140,000 troops. This month, I think there's like less than 24 embedded. And I think that points up a lot of real deficiencies in the coverage, and I think it's a whole other unexplored issue in terms of the coverage and sort of how we perceive Iraq. And I think it's something that's going to, particularly with the number of attacks increasing against Americans, that's going to be a continuing deficiency.
Thanks, Steve. Omar.
Well, I feel like I'm kind of in a pickle now because I wanted to start with my story on how I came to the Post, but my friend Rajiv just killed it. But I'm going to talk about my friends were part of the story, and I am the story. So I'm going to talk to you about how we waited for the war before it started. I just witnessed how people were excited about the war happening to just get rid of Saddam Hussein, and then gradually witnessed how frustrated they became. I remember before the war, when we gathered like in our neighbors' houses or in my house or like anywhere in the neighborhood, and we were like all excited about we always said like the Americans coming. We never said like multinational forces, and
Coalition of the willing, Omar.
yeah. So we were very excited because like for people like my generation, our only hope was just to finish studies and go out of Iraq, because that's where the future is, not inside Iraq. And so we were very excited that we'll get rid of the dictatorship, and then everything will just be great after that. Like I gave it 6 months to start to be great. So we would, and they were kind of late to come into Baghdad, I mean the American troops. So I remember we were like gathering in front of TV, listening to, watching news and watching like the Iraqi side saying like they're not here even, and watching the Arabiya and Jazeera channels saying like they are like on the borders of Baghdad. And I remember one of my cousins was like, one night was like, even if you were on camels, you would be here now. That's how frustrated they were, I swear to God. And I remember the night of April 8th, I went to sleep. I went to bed like something like 9 or 8 or 10 p.m. But before that, I was watching TV, which ran on generator, of course, by the way, and still is running on generator. I saw Al-Sahaf, who was the Iraqi Minister of Information, on Jazeera, saying on Jazeera channel, and he was like saying like the Americans are still on the borders of Basra, which is like the farthest like town in the city in South Iraq, and they will never be able to come, like even to put 1 foot in the Iraqi lands, and we're okay, don't worry, everything is okay. So I went to sleep, and on April the 9th, I woke up, opened the curtains, and here's an American tank in front of my house. Wow, that was fast. It was a tank. But anyway, so we were all excited, and you hear like rumors, or you hear news saying like Iraqis welcomed the American troops with flowers. I witnessed that. I saw people doing that. In fact, the day I went to the Palestine hotel and got the job with the Post, I saw people there welcoming American troops with flowers. They were very happy. And then things started to move on or not move on, and people started to get frustrated. And I remember when I got the job, I blacked out the whole thing about sending me back home, because I don't want to remember that, but I now remember it. And it was like from Friday, and you sent for me on Sunday, so it's only 2 days, it's okay. And I first, as he said, I first worked as a translator because I had no interest in being a journalist at all. Although my whole family is like, my aunts, my uncles, they're all journalists, or at least writers. But because journalism under Saddam was just mouthpiece to the government, so I was not interested in being a journalist. So I then like started as a translator, and then like realized like this is real journalism. I'm helping people to speak their, like to voice out their problems. So a few months later, I started in journalism, and also I witnessed the frustration with that. As he said, it was the golden age in journalism in Iraq, and for the Iraqi journalists, they were for the first time they were free to write about whatever they wanted, and that was the confusion they had. That's why they are still opinionated in their stories, because they don't know how to be balanced. It's the first time they write their own perspectives. So it's just it's a good time to speak what they want to talk about. And in July, and it was free press until last July, when the government asked the newspapers and radio stations, TV channels, to sign a pact not to like, according to the government, if you, for instance, according to this pact, if you talk about corruption, if you don't have the evidence, if you don't have the document, you'll be tried as a journalist. And that's just not journalism. It's just going back to how it was under Saddam. In fact, under Saddam, you knew your limits. Now you don't know. You just get into them. You all hear about like how foreign journalists are threatened in Iraq, and I would like to talk about the Iraqi journalists, because at the end of the day, foreign journalists can just get a flight and go back of Iraq, go out of Iraq. But we as Iraqis, we just go back homes, and it's really dangerous for us. We don't, like for instance, I remember when I was in Fallujah, October 2004 with the Marines, I had, the post gave me all the gears. I had flak jacket, I had a helmet, everything I needed. Iraqi journalists, and I think Jackie remembers, they didn't have anything. Even the Americans gave them flak jackets without the plates. They gave them only the cloth to wear it. And they didn't know, they thought the cloth is bulletproof. Until I told them in Fallujah that no, it's not, you have to have plates on in them. And this is the kind of environment Iraqi journalists work in, is they don't have insurance, they don't have, if they get threatened, no one will pay them to go out. They will be totally on their own. And after writing the story, they go back home and face the even more like danger of being kidnapped, of being like killed in the home. And there are more than 80 journalists killed since 2003. 64 of them are Iraqis. It's just, and that's because they don't have any precautions. They just go out in soft cars. They go, and when they go to cover military assaults, they just go by themselves. Like they cover the Iraqi side, and the Iraqi military, the Iraqi army don't have even armored cars, so they sit in the back of a pickup to cover their stories. That's really frustrating. And along the way, since April 18th, when I started with Post, I was always afraid of leaving, of being forced to leave Iraq, because I'm threatened. And that's why I got threatened in October 2004. I was chased from my home to the office. And the only thing, I didn't want to go out, and I didn't make it a big deal. My bureau chief was Carl Vick that time, and he wanted to send me to outside Iraq, and I just said no. So I volunteered to go to Fallujah to cover the assault, just 3 weeks outside of Baghdad. And then, but my journey with journalism in Iraq ended June 15, when I was chased again from the office to my house. And that was like, I was coming here anyway, and that was like the time when I said, like, it's not worth it, I have to leave now. So 4 days after that, I left Iraq. But I tell my colleagues here, I want to go back to Iraq, because that's why I am a journalist. If it's hard for Steve to do it, for any one of them to do it now, it's not that hard for me. It's more danger. Yeah, it's more dangerous for me, but it's just a moral, I think, obligation to do it. If foreigners cannot do it, I can do it. And if I get, I don't want to say killed, but if I get like if I have to leave Iraq again, it will be for a noble reason, and I want to do it. And that's my goal, just to come here, finish my studies, and go back to Iraq and continue in it. And hopefully we'll have my own newspaper in the future. Well, in fact, my family owned a newspaper until '91, so I want to go back and re-establish it, to republish it. That's what I wanted to say for now.
Thanks, Omar. I think all of you here clearly have a very strong commitment to the idea that somehow journalism is important and does make a difference to the world, to the country, to just people's ability to know. And yet, our profession is certainly under attack. not just physical danger, as you describe, Omar, in Iraq. And I wonder, how does it feel? I know, Jackie, you've written about this a little. When you're in Iraq, you're risking your life, and yet you know in some way what you're doing is not only ignored, but disesteemed and sometimes even attacked, as if you were doing the devil's work rather than the Lord's work.
Well, I think the Iraq War has polarized this country in a way that no issue probably has since the Vietnam War. And I think people look toward media sources to reaffirm their previously held beliefs. And so if I write something that people perceive as pro-military, if they're anti-military, they accuse me of bias. If they're on the other side, they accuse me of bias. And that was one of the hardest things that I faced when I was in Iraq was, I simply was there to tell the story, whatever that story was. And I did it with an open mind. I did it in a very objective way. And yet people didn't believe what I wrote. And that was very, very difficult, to be risking your life for a story and not to make people feel good about whatever opinion they had. I mean, all of us get into journalism simply to tell stories, and not because we have an agenda. That's the listeners and the viewers and the readers have agendas, and they look for us to reaffirm their beliefs. And when we don't do that, they get really angry with us. And that was very disheartening for me as a journalist.
Anyone else?
I think to some degree, the daily drumbeat of coverage has become commoditized for people, and that's not to detract from the singular power of great dispatchers like Steve's body of work from last year, or Anthony Shadid's work in 2003, material that just transcends everything else that's coming out of Iraq at that given moment. But even so, I clearly had the sense that regardless of how revelatory a story was, it was being sort of dumped into one of two baskets, as Jackie says. Either, the people who were very critical of the overall enterprise there and said, if it was a story that tended to reaffirm their views, go get them, show us yet again how this policy is screwed up. Or, on the other side, people saying, there you go again, liberal media, harping on the negative. Why don't you show us all the great progress that's being made? We've had an interesting phenomenon of late, particularly at the Washington Post, of having several books come out this fall on Iraq. First being Tom Ricks's book, Fiasco. My book is out. Bob Woodward's book, State of Denial, has been recently released, as well as a book by Karen DeYoung on Colin Powell. And a number of people have said, why didn't you write about all this stuff at the time? Why are you sort of holding it back for a book? And my answer to that is, much of the content of my book, and I know the case for both Tom and others, is that this was stuff that was reported on subsequent to our time in Iraq and really done specifically for a book project and not while we were at the Post. It wasn't like we were just shoveling good notebooks in a drawer to write for a book. But I think that there is something to be said for an institution like the Post that gives people, its reporters, the time to pursue these long-form projects and allows them to come at the story of Iraq in a fundamentally different way from the daily dispatch in the newspaper. And given the reception these books have had, at least I like to think that they are helping to make Americans aware of elements of our engagement in Iraq and elements of our foreign policy and military policy that, while touched upon in daily newspaper stories, really haven't kind of struck a nerve the way that it sometimes does when it is in the narrative form of a 400-page book. And so I think that in some way is helping to, increase awareness and to help shape the debate.
Well, and yet I think it's undeniable that all of us who write do so within a climate of what we sort of know the boundary lines of acceptability are. And I'm wondering, Washington at this point has put the goalposts at a certain point in terms of what you, where the line is where you fear you'll be accused of being a liberal, panderer. And I'm wondering, when you're out there in Iraq, did you all feel that confinement in any way? And did you feel that you had to give a little to one side in order to be able to be more truthful and possibly more extreme on the other?
I had a general one time say to me, the problem with you media is you're out to get George Bush. And I said to him, with all due respect, sir, and you probably would find this unpatriotic, I haven't thought about the president since I've been here. And that was very true. And I think that the problem is that there's an expectation, because there are so many journalists today who engage in advocacy journalism, that all of us have an opinion and have an agenda. And the great thing I love about the Washington Post is that as reporters, we don't have an agenda. And it wasn't hard for me to be in Iraq and to write about a war. People would ask me, were you for or against the war? It doesn't matter. I'm here because there was a war. That's my job as a journalist. And it really doesn't matter what I think about the efforts. I mean, I could be analytical about it but I can't make up the images that you see on television. I can't make up the paragraphs that you read about in the Washington Post. So I found it very easy to be objective. Very, very easy, because I was simply reporting what I saw. And I think my colleagues might reflect that.
I know Steve probably has some interesting thoughts on this, but when you're sitting back in Washington and you're writing, an analysis story about military strategy in the here and now, you feel compelled to get some voices on both sides. I'll talk to these guys who seem to be pro-Pentagon and these people who seem to be anti-administration, and do what journalists do and try to balance everything up. When you're out on the ground and you're just talking to people, you're just hearing what they have to say, and in many cases are putting it in. And, when you're sitting out there with a bunch of guys who, are at the kind of grunt level, who are engaging in the Sisyphean task of going out and patrol every day, getting shot up, coming back, going out, doing it again and again, and their frustration mounts, and they're making their feelings known to you and engaging with you. It's not like you feel like you have to go out and let's go find now another group of soldiers who are really gung-ho about this so we can have, this is a slice of life out there. And in many ways, I think that, I don't want to say the rules are different, but foreign correspondency, in many ways lends itself to getting slightly more raw, vivid, images, commentary, and perspective in the paper, as opposed to those of us sitting back in the comfort of an office in Washington, talking to experts.
Yeah, I don't think I really felt confined at all, and I don't think the criticism actually really bothered me either, because it's exactly the way Jackie was saying. The emails you get, people would read into your stories what they wanted to see, and I'd write a story, and then people would come at it from different ends of this political spectrum. And for me, the real issue was, it was a war, and I wanted to present it as realistically and as graphically, frankly, as I possibly could, to present it for what it actually was. And the real confining thing was, as I alluded to before, the problem with the military was, I was, especially toward the end of my tour, I found myself thinking, well, is this going to keep me from getting another embed in X place? And, one of the most interesting examples was I had spent a lot of time with a unit in Mosul, and I had written several stories about this one company, and they were fairly, I think, politically neutral stories. I mean, they were sort of the war, and I wanted to write a story about a platoon that had a reputation within the brigade as being particularly ruthless. And I also wanted to sort of, and this, I think, in his way, is sort of my own agenda. I wanted it to be a way to write about the violence in Iraq, the violence that no one was really seeing. And so I hung out with this one platoon, and I talked to as many people as possible, and there was this one scene which I ended up leading with, where these guys had set up a sniper position in a building, and some insurgents, after launching an attack, just coincidentally pulled up in front of the building, and they were moving weapons from one car to another. And so this guy, the guy who was particularly focused on it, gave the order. The sniper shot one of the guys in the head and killed him instantly. And then they opened fire, and they killed a couple other guys, and they sped up. And when the attack was over, they went down to sort of survey the scene, and one of the guys in the platoon actually picked up a piece of this guy's skull and brought it back to the base, and for what they said was forensic evidence, but which was clearly some kind of, weird trophy sort of thing. And so I wrote about it, and I was never invited back to Mosul. And and when I would petition to come back, and I wanted to keep going back because it was a strategic place. I knew these guys, and of course the great irony was that the people I wrote about loved the story because it was real, but their commanders wouldn't let me back. And when I asked why, one of the public affairs officers finally said, well, one of the commanders feels there's been a breach of trust. So that to me was the most confining thing.
Well, before we get to questions for you all, let me just change the scene a bit and ask you all, not so much as journalists, but as observers, how do you think we're doing out there?
We're Washington Post journalists. We can't answer that question. You've asked us before, and we'll say it again.
Well, does anyone want to contravene Comrade Spinner's dictum?
The question is, how is America doing in Iraq?
Yeah. Maybe Omar, you feel free to answer that. I mean,
Omar's a Washington Post journalist.
I always feel free to answer these questions, but the news are a big evidence of how it is going in Iraq now. Do you hear anything good out of Iraq lately? Have you?
I'm not at liberty to reply.
Well, I am. I've been reading about Iraq since I've left, which was like June 19. I haven't read anything that made me hopeful since then. In fact, I was more hopeful when I was in Iraq, when I got threatened, because I felt like, okay, our voices are being heard, and okay, so people are pissed off, but I don't have any hope for the soon future because of the news I hear and because of what I hear from my family every day when I talk to them every day and friends. I don't have any friends left in Iraq now. I was the last one to leave Iraq. Friends, I mean from college, close friends. They all left Iraq, and that means our generation was supposed to be like the leaders of the future of Iraq, and we all left. We don't have hope in the future of Iraq, and we're waiting. We are frustrated, but we haven't given up yet, and I don't think we will. But we're waiting for something good to happen. We need a miracle now. It's already messed up.
Well, listen, before we close, let me remind you that the books of Rajiv and Jackie are outside. If you're moved to buy one, they'd certainly be willing to sign it. So join me in thanking our four panelists for coming this evening.